Welcome to Just Relationships, the show that offers you concrete ways to make your relationships better. Whether it's your boss, your spouse, your children, or your friends, the quality of your relationships in life directly affects how you feel about yourself and the success you achieve. Your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer, a psychotherapist, telecoach, author, and seminar leader, will interview top experts to help you learn to manage this essential part of your life. And now, here's your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer.
Today, we're going to look at the relationship between ethics and relationships. Is it possible to have a relationship that's unethical? Well, we know there are plenty of toxic relationships, and people often don't even realize they're in a toxic relationship. So, what does it mean to be ethical? As a human being, what does it mean to have an ethical relationship? I am very, very happy to have as my guest Dr. Arthur Dobrin, who is the Leader Emeritus of the Ethical Humanist Society of Long Island. He is also a retired Hofstra professor in social science and the humanities. Little philosophy thrown in there. And welcome, Dr. Arthur Dobrin.
Thank you, Dr. Spencer.
Well, I think I'm going to call you Arthur most of the time. I just wanted everyone to know.
Well, I can refer to you as Duffy.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh,
yeah. So what is that about, would you say, what is the connection between ethics and relationships?
Well, part of it has to do with how you define ethics. Some people would define ethics in a very abstract way. Some people would define it as in a very almost political way, if you'd like. But my definition of ethics, which is really a very traditional, almost ancient way of understanding it, and also it's a way of understanding it in the Eastern world, is that ethics is really all about relationships. That there is really very little distinction between ethics and relationships. That the way in which you think about ethics really rests upon the whole notion of what it means to be a human being, which in turn rests upon the idea, the anthropological idea, really, that what makes us human is the relationships that we have. So the question about what makes for a good relationship is no different than the question of what does it mean to be ethical.
Yes. I love that. And being a member of the Ethical Humanist Society for decades, and you being the leader of the Ethical Society for decades, I've always loved your version of ethics. And we think about work ethics, and which ultimately, in my view, good relationships equals good business. Ultimately, I think that's what that's about. And we often hear about it, mostly in the context, as you said, of abstract political workplace. So anthropological, I agree with you completely. We are both PhDs in social science, and the essence of being social. I mean, the essence of human nature is social, and the essence of social is relationships.
Yeah.
So,
So just going back to your example of business. I also taught for many years business ethics at Hofstra at the MBA level. And almost all the students I had were people who already were involved in business. And interestingly, a large percentage of the students actually came from the Northwell medical establishment, doctors, nurses, administrators, technicians, and so forth, probably a third of the class. So I had both people from the medical area as well as business people. And my approach to teaching those courses, which is unlike, I think, most business ethics courses, I really wasn't concerned with codes of ethics. What I was really concerned with in those classes was, what does it mean to be a good person? Because it seemed to me that it's pretty clear that, as you had said, Duffy, in the long run, the businesses that succeed, it's not as a general rule, of course, there are always exceptions to this, but as a general rule, the businesses that succeed are those businesses that rest upon good customer relationships. They rest upon treating their employees well, being fair, and in other words, it needs to be run by people who are concerned with or understand ethical relationships. So whether it is in the professions, which almost all of them tend to emphasize codes of ethics, to me, the codes of ethics really follow ethical relationships. If they're really inconsistent with good relationships, then the codes ultimately will fail. They'll simply become rules that people follow. And once you reduce relationships or ethics to rule following, you really miss you miss the essence of what it means to have a good relationship.
Wow, very good. It's kind of like the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law.
Exactly.
Yeah, and having taught at the American Management Association for decades, the general sense of my students over the years was embitterment that they compared their company mission to their actual behavior and hated it because the gap was so severe.
Yeah. And the conflict in all relationships, whether it's in professions or whether it's in personal relationships, is the conflict between self-interest and the interest of the other people around you.
Yes.
And when they don't coincide, and often they don't coincide, it then becomes how do you manage that in an equitable, fair, and respectful manner?
Right. That's almost inevitable, would you say, that there are differences, there are different needs, there are different approaches, there are different goals, there are different perspectives?
Oh, yes, all of that is true, certainly. Take any two people, I suppose maybe the only exception perhaps are identical twins who were raised in the same household. Maybe their interests coincide almost all the time. But barring that, of course, everyone's experience is different. Everyone's tastes are different. Everyone's interests are different. So sometimes it doesn't matter. I mean, sometimes it really doesn't matter. But sometimes and frequently it does. And so you have different interests is one element of it. And the other interest is whether you're looking at something in the short term or in the long term. For example, in business, it may be the short-term interest would be in terms of looking at the bottom line, the profit for this year. But what would require profit for this year in the long term may not be the same. And ethics requires a long-term view. The short-term view, which is simply the most extreme would be acting on impulses, would be the short-term view. I want it, I'll get it now. I feel this, I'll express it now. The very short-term view is sometimes can undermine the nature of a relationship, whether that's personal or whether that is in business or in the workplace.
Yeah, and not being mindful, not pushing your internal pause button, because the primitive brain, the amygdala, that's our permanent alarm system. And the body doesn't know the difference between physical threat and psychological threat, the loss of face, the loss of reputation, the loss of prestige is very threatening to people. So they'll not in the jungle, in the workplace or in the home, they'll do things instantly if they feel threatened. And the mirror neurons and the tit for tat, all of that, I say to simplify it, push your internal pause button.
Yeah. Well, you know, the studies that are done with the famous marshmallow studies.
Oh, yes, yes.
And, it's very early on, there are some kids who are able to wait things out, and there are others who act more impulsively. So in terms of raising children, I think it's important to be able, I'll use the word discipline, although that's often misused and misunderstood.
Yes.
But providing a structure for children in which they are required to postpone instant gratification is really an important part of lifelong learning in terms of how to manage good relationships. If somebody is constantly ruled by their impulses or constantly feel threatened by the smallest slight, that's very difficult relationship for somebody to maintain. It becomes fraught with all kinds of minefields. And, to walk around minefields all the time is it's a very uncomfortable relationship to be in. So, again, being able to distinguish between your own true needs and looking at it in the long term, being able to sort out what are the short-term needs that you have that you could postpone, and which are the short-term needs that you don't really have to have fulfilled at all. They really turn out to be pretty irrelevant. It doesn't really matter whether I get my chocolate or pistachio ice cream tonight. I can wait until tomorrow to get the thing I prefer. So postponing gratification, being able to sort out what's essential from what isn't essential, and then being able to understand it. And I think this is one of the keys of all ethics, is perspective taking, meaning being able to see the world through somebody else's eyes. So if you're in a personal relationship, what's the world look like through the eyes of your partner? If you are in, let's say, the workplace, what does the world look like through the eyes of my colleagues? If you're the CEO or the head of a company, what's the world look like through the people I employ or my customers? So perspective taking is a very large part of ethics, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. Now, to do that requires that you put aside your own immediate needs, that you can't possibly see the world through somebody else's eyes. If you're acting on your own impulses and your own wants, your own needs, that has to be set aside for a little bit. You have to bracket what you want, what your interests are, not permanently, but at least long enough to be able to understand that somebody else may see it in a different way.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And I'm thinking about seek first to understand and then to be understood by St. Francis of Assisi. And that was actually adopted by Steve Covey in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People was a very, very popular business book. I mean, businesses would order it by the droves for their people to read it and send them to courses on it. Mm-hmm. And it really is transcendent. It really is over and above how many, many people believe, think, consider. And my goodness, why should I think first how you understand? I want you to understand me. Right. I want you to understand me. Deborah Tannen wrote a book on communications between the genders. Please Understand Me was the title. Mm-hmm. So, just to explain the marshmallow test to people, you can correct me, Arthur, but basically there was one marshmallow placed on a table, and the experimenters left. They said, if you don't eat that in a half an hour, you're going to I'm going to give you 2 marshmallows. And the ones that ate it, they did longitudinal studies. The ones that ate it versus the ones that waited to get double the mushrooms, double the marshmallows, had a more successful in their careers. Now, I don't know if they also gauged the success in life. What are the measurements for that? But it was definitely careers.
Well, it's a famous study, and I haven't looked at the follow-ups in a number of years. But
yes.
In terms of the Covey book, for using it as an example, that's useful in making broad outlines. But the way in which I would approach my classes, and I think it's also very useful in personal relationships, is to present a scenario in which there is more than one possible good answer or more than one possible ethical answer. And then to be able to discuss that, because everybody could agree that you should be truthful. I don't. It's very hard to find somebody who would say, "Yeah, I think we should lie all the time." I mean, we know examples of that in the public life, of course, but most people would look at that and say, "That's really not how we want to live. It's not how I want my children to live. I don't want to raise them to be liars. We want people to be truthful." But what happens when there's a conflict between telling the truth and hurting somebody's feelings?
Yeah.
And I think that those kinds of conflicts between two good things or between two ethical values become really difficult for people to negotiate. We don't understand how, for one person, being truthful may be more important than whether you spare somebody's feelings, or the reverse. Yeah. How somebody would think that, sparing my feelings is far more important than being truthful. So being able to have discussions around those kinds of conflictual situations, I find in my classes, I found that to be far more useful than having books on business ethics, which told people, be truthful, don't screw people, set fair prices, and so forth. The classes often were revolved around discussions that presented ethical conflicts, where it wasn't truth versus lying, but it had to do with levels of truth, or what happens when telling the truth might mean that your company goes bankrupt, or those kinds of things. What happens at life, end of life situations, about whether you tell people the truth about things. Who wants to know the truth? Who doesn't want to know the truth? What should a doctor do? Does the doctor tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, which they demand in the courtroom, but it may not be the best course to follow in a hospital room? So those kinds of things are really, those are difficult ethical questions. And originally you were asking about the relationship between ethics and relationships. And I started by saying, well, good relationships, of course, are ethical. But that doesn't mean that knowing what ethics entails in real life situations is always easy. I don't think it's as easy as making a list of things.
Yeah, I think it boils down for people to remember the concept of values, a value conflict. And in my courses, my management courses, where I asked managers, they were interested in managing people in the best way, because obviously they wanted people to be as productive as possible. List your values. And they would, always say honesty. It's easy to list the values. Sure. But as you say, what are the nuances, the shades of gray? So I'm just curious, the medical and personnel and the business employees in your classes, did they on their own move into personal or intimate relationships, or did they stick to the more formal public relationships?
Well, since I set up the class and I developed the syllabus on my own, the whole thing was skewed towards personal relationships. The book that I used was set up in terms of business ethics and conflicts within business. But the discussions that I had, I always made sure that if we were talking about business, they saw the relationship between that and their personal lives, or the other way around, which sometimes people would initiate discussions about more personal sort of things. What do they do about their colleague who doesn't bathe very often? I mean, that sort of thing. Or when I actually remember, what do you do about a colleague who's wearing so much perfume that the person can hardly breathe? So it takes place within a business context, but it really is a personal relationship. So the classes, I would say probably half of the discussion in the class was around what I would describe as personal relations, and the other half had to do with business. I also taught media ethics. Now, if you can think of, you probably can't think of two professions that have worse reputations in terms of being ethical than business and media. Journalists always, rank way down at the bottom, professions people hate, and business ranks pretty low as well. So both of those classes, when I would tell people I'm teaching business ethics, I'm teaching media ethics, they would say, well, isn't that an oxymoron?
Yeah, yes.
People think journalists can't be ethics, and they can't be ethical. Business people can't be ethical. And also public relations was part of the media ethics class. So all these people had terrible reputations. And part of it is deserved because, we have lots of interaction with businesses. And most of the interaction is perfectly fine. We rarely get mistreated, but we do so much with business. We interact, we're buying things all the time. We're employed, we work, or we have been working, or we want to work. So people are constantly interacting with businesses. And if you add up all of those, how many times we interact, there are bound to be times in which we feel as if we're being mistreated. It's inevitable. And I think that, the media, because of the political polarization, people, sort of choose sides. Well, I hate that outlet. They never tell the truth, and vice versa for the ones that you prefer or don't like. So, however, my emphasis in both of those classes is that it really has to start with the people who are in the classes, which is if you're going to be a journalist, you're going to be a public relations person, you have to make sure that you are as truthful as you could possibly be in providing your client in the best possible light. But you can't cross the line of being lying and manipulating. And if you're going to be a journalist, you cannot use people for your story. You can't disrespect people. You can't tell them, you can't sort of get in their good graces, essentially manipulating them because you want to get a story. And those are the things I think that people have real trouble with in business. They believe that businesses are out to cheat them. They think that journalists are manipulating them, and they think the public relations people are lying to them. So make sure that you don't cross those lines, because it only takes a few who do to really have the public think of those professions as being corrupt. So it begins at the bottom. It begins with ethics.
Yeah, the bottom. You said the bottom.
Bottom, but also the top. I mean, the CEOs clearly, and the people who own businesses.
Right.
They set the tone. But
right.
But even if they set the tone, doesn't mean that you, as the employee, have to accept it. I mean, there are things that you could do. There are ways in which you can manage this, and if you can't, then you really have a crisis in conscience. How much do I really need this work? How much do I really need the salary that I have? Can I really accept a lower salary and maintain my good sense of who I am? Sometimes people have to make really, really, really difficult decisions. If you don't put up with a garbage job and you can't find any other work, and there are people, and your health and your depends upon this, paying your rent depends upon it, well, then maybe you have to do this. But most of the time, it really doesn't come down to that. I think many, many people have perhaps reassessed what's really essential in their lives. And are the things that are essential, do they really cost things? I mean, is there really a price to be put on it? And I think most people would say, no, the things that they most value, mainly their relationships, their families, their spouses, their mates, those things are the things that are most important. And we don't buy those.
Yeah, we don't buy those. Yes, that's...
Yeah, we don't.
Ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Duffy.
No. I was just going to respond to you. We cannot buy love, so to speak. And that dilemma, I'm thinking about people I know personally and professionally, clients who really suffer from jobs that they hate, and they can't see past, leaving that job, and what would they do, and what is the job market, and where is the locale, and should it be virtual? Do I have to show up at work? This job, I don't have to show up at work. I can work from home. That job, they make me go in 5 days a week. And what is the cost of gas? And so what is essential is invisible to the eye, said the fox to the little prince, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you hate your work and you spend 8 hours a day, 50 weeks out of the year doing it, that is half of your waking life, you hate. It's hard to imagine how at the end of that workday, you can turn all of that off and then suddenly be a kind, respectful, compassionate, loving, supportive person to the other people in your life who you said really are the people that those are the things that are most important to you. So sometimes it means a real thorough evaluation. What would it mean to downsize? What would it mean to have perhaps a vacation that's not so expensive, or forego a vacation this year? Or what would it mean to spend less on some things? Do I really need it all? Are there other ways of getting what it is that I think I need in a different way?
Dr. Arthur Dobrin, this has been such a wonderful show. And for everyone who is enjoying this show, the good news is that Dr. Dobrin is coming back next week for part 2 of ethics and relationships. And I have so many questions for you, Arthur. And this comes up so often, and the materialism of American society and looking good and prestige items. And now I need this for my lifestyle. Oh my God. And just before when you were talking about the media, I was thinking about Brian Williams, and literally knowing he was lying in his reporting, and that I was so astonished that they kept him, that he had a hiatus, but then they allowed him back in. And next week I want to talk to you about more the professional and the personal, moving into the personal, and how we can have good ethical relationships in our homes, our love lives. So this is Dr. Duffy Spencer saying goodbye for now and wishing you great relationships.